When everything else in your life falls apart, sometimes all you have left is your dog. Jake Smith knew this truth better than most. His marriage was over. His son barely spoke to him, and at 42, he was starting life over in his hometown of Cedar Lake. Scout, his loyal German shepherd, had been there through every sleepless night and difficult day. So when Jake noticed small bumps appearing on Scout's back, he figured they were just pimples. Dogs get them sometimes. He made an appointment with the local vet, expecting nothing more than some antibiotics and reassurance. But Dr. Elena Vasquez found something that made her hands shake as she examined Scout. The bumps weren't pimples. Inside each one was a tiny metallic object, perfectly placed beneath the skin. They looked like tracking devices. Within days, other pets around town showed up with identical bumps. Jake realized someone had been doing something to the animals. In Cedar Lake, something that had been going on for years. What Jake discovered next would change everything he thought he knew about his quiet hometown. But who had been watching them all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the pine trees surrounding Cedar Lake, casting long shadows across the familiar path Jake Smith had walked every day for the past 18 months. Scout trotted beside him, nose to the ground, tail wagging with the simple contentment that only dogs possess. This daily ritual had become Jake's anchor, the one constant in a life that had been turned upside down and slowly reassembled. Piece by careful piece, Jake paused at his favorite spot overlooking the lake, adjusting the camera strap around his neck. The water stretched out before them like a mirror, reflecting the early autumn sky. He'd grown up here, swum in these waters as a boy, brought his own son Tyler here during better times. Coming back to Cedar Lake hadn't been his first choice. But sometimes life doesn't offer you the luxury of first choices. "Come on, boy," Jake murmured, scratching Scout behind the ears. The German shepherd looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. Scout had been with him through the worst of it, the divorce proceedings, the nights when Jake couldn't sleep, the phone calls with Tyler that ended in arguments or awkward silences. While everything else fell apart, Scout remained constant. Jake raised his camera and captured the morning light dancing on the water. Photography had become his profession now, though it felt strange calling it that. For 15 years, he'd been a paramedic in Chicago rushing toward emergencies, making split-second decisions that meant life or death for strangers. Now he spent his time trying to capture beauty instead of racing against tragedy. The transition hadn't been easy, but Cedar Lake offered enough weddings, family portraits, and local events to keep him afloat. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his career helping people he didn't know, but couldn't help his own marriage survive. Sarah had tried to be patient with the long shifts, the stress, the way he'd come home carrying the weight of other people's worst days. But patience has its limits, and Jake had found his wife's breaking point the hard way. "At least you don't judge me for my mistakes," Jake said to Scout, who responded by nudging against his leg. Dogs understood loyalty in a way that seemed increasingly rare. Among humans, his phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Can't make it this weekend. Too much homework." Jake stared at the message, knowing it was probably true, but suspecting it was also convenient. Their relationship had been strained even before the divorce, but living 3 hours apart hadn't helped. At 16, Tyler was old enough to choose which parent he wanted to spend time with, and increasingly, that choice didn't include his father. Jake pocketed the phone without responding. He'd learned that pushing Tyler only made things worse. Time and space, that's what the therapist had recommended. Give the boy room to figure out his own feelings about the divorce, about his father's choices, about the complicated reality of adult relationships that teenagers weren't equipped to understand. They continued their walk, following the path that wound through the residential area where Jake had rented a small house. Cedar Lake had always been the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where Mrs. Chun still brought cookies to new neighbors, and where people left their doors unlocked. It was the opposite of Chicago in every way that mattered to Jake's wounded soul. "Morning, Jake," called a voice from across the street. He looked up to see Dr. Elena Vasquez loading supplies into her veterinary van. She'd moved to town about the same time Jake had, setting up practice after working at a larger animal hospital downstate. They'd struck up an easy friendship based on both being newcomers trying to find their place in a community with deep roots. "Morning, Elena. Early house call?" Jake crossed the street with Scout, who immediately began investigating the interesting smells around the veterinary van. "The Henderson's maw is having some complications," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Sometimes I think I should have specialized in house cats instead of large animals," but her smile suggested she wouldn't trade her work for anything easier. Elena was one of the few people in town who understood what it meant to start over. She'd left her previous job for reasons she didn't discuss, but Jake recognized the look of someone carrying their own complicated history. They'd shared coffee a few times, conversations that stayed carefully in the present tense, avoiding the past that had brought them both to this small lakeside town. "Scout's looking good," she observed, crouching down to let the dog sniff her hand. "How's that bump on his back doing?" Jake's hand automatically went to the spot she meant. "Still there. Maybe a little bigger? I keep meaning to bring him in, but he doesn't seem bothered by it." "Dogs are stoic," Elena said, standing and brushing dust from her knees. "They don't complain until something really hurts. Why don't you swing by the clinic this week?" "I can. Take a look." "I'll do that," Jake promised, though part of him hoped it would turn out to be nothing. Scout was healthy, energetic, eating well. One small bump didn't seem like cause for alarm. Elena climbed into her van and drove off with a wave. Jake continued his walk, thinking about the easy comfort of that conversation. In Chicago, he'd barely known his neighbors' names. Here, people actually cared about each other's animals, asked after family members, remembered birthdays. It was the kind of community he wanted Tyler to experience, though his son seemed to prefer the anonymity of city life. Jake's photography business was slowly gaining momentum. He'd shot 3 weddings this summer, several family portrait sessions, and was building a reputation for nature photography that captured Cedar Lake's seasonal beauty. The work was satisfying in a way that emergency medicine had never been. Instead of rushing toward crisis, he now had time to wait for the perfect light, to compose shots that might bring joy instead of merely preventing tragedy. His rental house came into view, a modest 2-bedroom with a small yard where Scout could run. Jake had furnished it simply, keeping only what mattered from his previous life. The divorce settlement had been fair but not generous, and starting over required letting go of accumulated possessions that had once seemed important. Inside, Jake made coffee while Scout settled into his favorite spot by the kitchen window. This was their routine: early morning walk, breakfast for both of them. Then Jake would review yesterday's photos while planning the day's work. It was peaceful, predictable, healing in its own quiet way. He pulled up the Henderson family portraits he'd shot last weekend, adjusting color and contrast on his laptop. The work required patience and attention to detail qualities he'd developed during his paramedic years, but rarely had time to use. There was something meditative about post-processing, finding the perfect balance of light and shadow that brought a photograph to life. A knock at the door interrupted his concentration. Scout barked once, then wagged his tail to greeting. Reserved for known friends. Jake opened the door to find Marcus Williams, Cedar Lake Sheriff, and one of Jake's closest friends from childhood. "Got time for coffee?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. They'd maintained this friendship through the decades, even when Jake was living in Chicago. Marcus had never left Cedar Lake, taking over as sheriff when his father retired, marrying his high school sweetheart, raising 3 kids who were now adults with children of their own. "Always," Jake said, pouring a second cup. "What brings you by so early?" Marcus settled into the kitchen chair that had become his unofficial spot during these visits. He was a big man who'd played football in high school and still looked like he could handle himself in a confrontation, but his approach to law enforcement emphasized conversation over conflict. "Had a weird call yesterday," Marcus said, absently petting Scout. "The Millers reported that their lab, Bruno, has been acting strange, lethargic, not eating much. They found some odd bumps on his back, similar to what you mentioned about Scout." Jake's attention sharpened. As a paramedic, he'd learned to pay attention when patterns emerged. Similar how? Small raised bumps. Perfectly round. The dog doesn't seem to be in pain, but the owners are worried. Marcus sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Probably nothing, but it's unusual for multiple pets to develop the same symptoms around the same time. Elena mentioned wanting to look at Scout's bump. Jake said, "Maybe I should schedule that appointment sooner rather than later. Probably a good idea. Could be something environmental, new plant species, different food supplier, who knows?" Marcus's tone was casual, but Jake detected an undertone of concern. Small-town sheriffs learned to notice unusual patterns before they became bigger problems. They talked for another half hour about town news, mutual friends, the upcoming fall festival that was Cedar Lake's biggest annual event. Normal conversation between old friends, but Jake found himself thinking about those bumps. In his paramedic training, he'd learned that coincidences were rare in medicine. When multiple patients presented similar symptoms, that was usually a common cause. After Marcus left, Jake called Dr. Vasquez's clinic and scheduled an appointment for Scout that afternoon. The bump was probably benign, but Jake had learned not to ignore his instincts. Those same instincts that had served him well during medical emergencies were now suggesting that something unusual was happening in their quiet town. He spent the morning editing photos and returning client calls, but his mind kept drifting to the conversation with Marcus. How many pets in Cedar Lake had developed similar bumps? Was there a pattern to the affected animals? His analytical mind, trained through years of emergency response, began organizing questions that needed answers. Scout dozed in his favorite sunny spot, completely unconcerned about the growing attention his health was receiving. Dogs lived in the present moment, trusting their humans to handle whatever complications arose. Jake envied that simple faith, even as he felt the familiar stirring of investigative curiosity that had once driven him to excel in emergency medicine. As afternoon approached, Jake clipped Scout's leash to his collar and prepared for what he expected would be a routine veterinary visit. He had no way of knowing that Dr. Elena Vasquez was about to discover something that would shatter the peaceful life he'd worked so hard to rebuild in Cedar Lake. The bump on Scout's back was about to become the thread that, when pulled, would unravel a conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight for over 15 years. The Cedar Lake Veterinary Clinic occupied a converted farmhouse on the town's outskirts. Its original white clapboard siding now painted a cheerful blue-green that complemented the surrounding pine trees. Jake had been here only once before, when he'd first adopted Scout from the county shelter, but the building's welcoming atmosphere hadn't changed. Wind chimes hung from the wraparound porch, and the waiting area still smelled of pine cleaner and that distinctive combination of antiseptic and animal that all veterinary offices seemed to share. "Jake Smith and Scout," he told the receptionist, a young woman whose name tag read Kathy. She smiled and indicated they should take a seat in the waiting area, where an elderly man sat with a carrier containing what appeared to be a very disgruntled cat. Scout settled beside Jake's chair with the patience of a well-trained dog. though his ears perked up at every new sound. The afternoon appointment time had been Elena's suggestion: fewer pets, more time to properly examine whatever was going on with Scout's mysterious bump. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Sorry about this weekend? Maybe next time?" The message felt like an olive branch, small but significant. Jake typed back, "No problem. Love you." He hesitated before hitting send, then decided honesty was better than playing it cool with his own son. Scout, Dr. Vasquez, appeared in the doorway, leading to the examination rooms. She wore scrubs printed. With tiny dogs and cats, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Ready for us?" The examination room was smaller than Jake remembered, with a stainless steel table in the center and cabinets lined with medical supplies that reminded him of his paramedic days. Elena lifted Scout onto the table with practiced ease, her hands gentle but thorough as she began her examination. "He's in excellent condition overall," she said, running her fingers along Scout's flanks and checking his eyes, ears, and mouth. "Good muscle tone, healthy coat, proper weight. You're taking good care of him." "He takes care of me more than the other way around," Jake admitted. "What do you think about that bump?" Elena's expression grew more serious as her fingers found the raised area on Scout's back. "Let me feel this more carefully." She palpated the bump with professional precision, her brow furrowing as she worked. "Jake, this doesn't feel like any normal growth I've encountered." "What do you mean?" "It's perfectly round, for one thing. And the consistency is unusual, too firm for a cyst, too regular for a tumor." She continued her examination, pressing gently around the edges of the bump. "I'm going to need to take some x-rays." Jake felt his stomach tighten. In his paramedic experience, doctors ordered additional tests when they'd found something concerning. "Is Scout in any danger?" "I don't think so, at least not immediately. But I want to understand what we're dealing with before making any recommendations." Elena's voice carried the careful neutrality of a medical professional, trying not to alarm a patient's family while still conveying the seriousness of the situation. The X-ray process required mild sedation to keep Scout still, and Jake found himself pacing the waiting room while Elena worked. The elderly man with the cat had been replaced by a woman with a small terrier, and Jake noticed that she kept checking the similar bump on her dog's back. "Excuse me," Jake said, approaching her chair. "I couldn't help but notice your dog has a bump similar to my Scout's. How long has yours had it?" The woman looked up with relief, as if she'd been hoping someone would ask. "About 3 weeks now. I'm Mrs. Henderson. You might know my husband Bill from the hardware store. This is Maggie." She gestured to the terrier, who was smaller than Scout but alert and friendly. "Dr. Vasquez wanted to examine it today. I've been worried sick." "My dog has a similar bump," Jake said. "When did you first notice it?" "Right after Labor Day weekend." Bill thought it was nothing, but it seems to be getting bigger. Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice. "Between you and me, I've heard at least 3 other families mention the same thing about their pets. The Garcia's cat, the Johnson's retriever, even old Mr. Peterson's hound dog." Jake felt the familiar chill of recognition that had served him well during medical emergencies. Multiple cases with identical presentations usually meant a common cause. Have all these pets been to the same places? Same food, same treats, same areas of town? "That's what's so strange," Mrs. Henderson said. "We all shop at different stores, walk our pets in different areas. The only thing we have in common is living in Cedar Lake." Before Jake could respond, Elena appeared in the waiting room doorway. Her expression was carefully controlled, but Jake recognized the look of a medical professional who discovered something unexpected and disturbing. "Jake, could I speak with you privately?" They moved to her office, a small room behind the examination area, filled with veterinary journals and continuing education certificates. Elena closed the door and gestured for Jake to sit, but remained standing herself, another sign that whatever she'd found was serious. Scout's X-rays show something I've never seen before, she began, pulling up digital images on her computer screen. Look at this. The X-ray clearly showed Scout's skeletal structure, but there was something else, a small, dense object perfectly centered within the bump on his back. It appeared to be metallic, with what looked like tiny geometric patterns etched into its surface. What is that? Jake asked, though his paramedic training was already suggesting possibilities he didn't want to consider. I don't know, Elena said quietly. It's not biological. The density suggests metal, possibly with electronic components. Jake, this looks like some kind of device that's been deliberately implanted. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Implanted? You mean someone put that in Scout intentionally? I can't think of any other explanation. The placement is too precise to be accidental, and there's no scar tissue suggesting it was traumatic. This device was placed surgically, with care to avoid damaging surrounding tissue. Jake stared at the X-ray, his mind racing through implications. Mrs. Henderson in your waiting room said multiple pets in town have similar bumps. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we X-ray every affected animal I can find, Elena interrupted. If this is what I think it is, we're looking at a systematic implantation of electronic devices in Cedar Lake's pet population. But why? Who would do something like this? Elena shook her head. I don't know. But Jake, there's something else. I've been keeping records of unusual pet symptoms for the past year. Just good medical practice. Looking back through my files, I can identify at least 12 animals that developed similar bumps over the past 8 months. All healthy pets. All different breeds and ages, all with owners who are longtime Cedar Lake residents. Jake felt his old paramedic instincts kicking in, the need to gather information, identify patterns, understand the scope of the emergency. 12 animals that you know of. There could be more who haven't brought their pets in yet. Exactly. Elena pulled Scout's file from a cabinet. I'm going to keep him overnight for observation. I want to monitor these devices, see if they're active, try to understand what they're designed to do. Active? Jake's voice rose. You mean they might be functioning? I don't know yet, but Jake, devices like this aren't implanted for fun. Someone has invested considerable time, money, and expertise to place sophisticated electronics in our pets. The question is why. As Jake drove home alone, Scout's empty leash on the passenger seat, his mind churned through possibilities. Electronic surveillance devices implanted in pets could serve multiple purposes, tracking animal movements, monitoring household conversations if they included microphones, even establishing some kind of communication network using the animals as unwitting carriers. The more he thought about it, the more disturbed he became. Someone had been systematically violating the pets, and by extension, the families of Cedar Lake. This wasn't random vandalism or a teenage prank. This was organized, sophisticated, and ongoing. Jake parked in his driveway and sat in the truck for several minutes, trying to process what Elena had shown him. The X-ray image of that metallic device embedded in Scout's back kept replaying in his mind. His loyal companion, who had been with him through the worst period of his life, was carrying some stranger's electronic device beneath his skin. The violation felt personal and professional simultaneously. As a paramedic, Jake had seen what people could do to each other, but this felt different. This was an attack on innocence, on trust, on the simple relationship between people and their pets. Tomorrow, he would start asking questions. Tonight, he would research electronic surveillance devices and try to understand what kind of enemy they were facing. Because one thing was clear, someone had turned the beloved pets of Cedar Lake into Pimples, unwilling participants in a conspiracy that was still unfolding. Jake looked at his house, which had felt like a refuge just that morning, and wondered what else in his peaceful new life was not what it seemed. Jake barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the X-ray image of Scout's implanted device, its geometric patterns etched with precision that spoke of sophisticated engineering. By 6 in the morning, he was dressed and driving toward the Cedar Lake Historical Society, a converted Victorian mansion that housed the town's archives and memory. Mrs. Patterson, the society's elderly librarian, looked surprised to see anyone so early. She was a thin woman in her 70s who had lived in Cedar Lake her entire life and seemed to know every story, scandal, and secret the town had ever harbored. "Jake Smith, isn't it? You're Bill Smith's boy. Came back after your divorce." Her directness was typical of small-town residents who saw no point in pretending they didn't know each other's business. "What brings you here at the crack of dawn?" "I'm researching unusual events in Cedar Lake's history," Jake said. "Anything involving animals, health issues, or outside organizations that might have operated in the area." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose with interest. "That's quite specific. Are you working on a photography project?" Jake hesitated, then decided on partial truth. "I'm investigating some unusual health issues affecting local pets. I want to understand if there's any historical context." "Health issues?" Mrs. Patterson's expression sharpened. "What kind of health issues?" "Unknown growths, possibly related to environmental factors or outside interference." The librarian was quiet for a moment, studying Jake's face. "Follow me," she said finally. "There might be something you need to see." She led him to the archives room, a climate-controlled space lined with filing cabinets and document boxes. Mrs. Patterson moved with purpose, pulling several folders from different cabinets and spreading them across a large table. "Cedar Lake has been home to several outside organizations over the years," she began, opening the first folder. "Most were benign summer camps, retreat centers, that sort of thing. But there was one that always struck me as odd." She pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping dated 1990. The headline read, "Meridian Biotech announces Cedar Lake Research Facility." The accompanying photo showed a modern glass building surrounded by pine trees. Meridian Biotech operated here from 1990 to 2005, Mrs. Patterson explained. They claimed to be researching agricultural applications of biotechnology, but they were very secretive about their actual work. Federal contracts, military connections, all very hush-hush. Jake studied the newspaper photo. What happened to them? They left suddenly in 2005. One day they were there, the next day the facility was empty. No explanation, no goodbye. Just abandoned buildings and a lot of unanswered questions. Mrs. Patterson opened another folder, revealing documents related to the facility's closure. There were rumors, of course. Some people said they were researching biological weapons. Others thought it was pharmaceutical development. But the strangest stories involved animals. Animals? Several residents reported that their pets acted strangely during the years Meridian operated. Dogs would disappear for hours and return with no memory of where they'd been. Cats developed unusual behavioral patterns. Livestock showed signs of stress without apparent cause. Jake felt his pulse quicken. Did anyone investigate these reports? Sheriff Williams Marcus's father looked into it briefly, but Meridian had federal authorization for their work. Local law enforcement was essentially told to stay away. Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice. "Between you and me, I always suspected they were using our animals for testing." The folder contained several more newspaper clippings, including one from 2005 with the headline, "Meridian Biotech Facility Abandoned Following Federal Review." The article was brief and uninformative, mentioning only that the company had ceased operations and relocated their research to other sites. "Where's the facility now?" Jake asked. "Still there, officially abandoned. It's about 5 miles north of town, past the old lumber road. The buildings are still standing, though I imagine they're in poor condition by now. Jake photographed the relevant documents with his phone, his mind already planning a visit to the abandoned facility. Mrs. Patterson, have you noticed anything unusual about pets in town recently? The librarian's eyes sharpened. You mean the bumps? Jake's surprise must have shown on his face because Mrs. Patterson smiled grimly. This is a small town, Jake. When multiple families start worrying about their pets developing identical symptoms, word gets around. My neighbor's dog has one of those bumps. So does the mayor's cat. How many pets do you think are affected? I'd guess at least a dozen, possibly more. People don't always talk about their animals' health problems unless they're serious. She paused. You think this is connected to Meridian somehow? I don't know yet, Jake said honestly. But the timing is suspicious. Sophisticated research facility operates for 15 years, then disappears. A decade later, pets start developing unusual growths that contain what appear to be electronic devices. Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. Electronic devices? Jake realized. He'd said too much, but Mrs. Patterson was clearly an ally worth trusting. Dr. Vasquez x-rayed my dog yesterday. She found what looks like a deliberately implanted surveillance device. Dear God, Mrs. Patterson whispered. They're still here, aren't they? Still conducting their experiments. That's what I intend to find out. Jake spent another hour reviewing documents, taking notes on dates, personnel changes, and any references to animal research. The picture that emerged was of a well-funded organization with federal backing that had operated with minimal local oversight for 15 years. One document particularly caught his attention, a 1998 Town Council meeting transcript that mentioned complaints from residents about unusual animal behaviors, and Meridian's response that they were conducting harmless behavioral studies with full federal authorization. Behavioral studies. Jake photographed that page twice by mid-morning. He had compiled a substantial collection of evidence suggesting that Meridian Biotech had a history of using Cedar Lake's animals for research purposes. The connection to the current implanted devices wasn't proven, but it was highly suggestive. Mrs. Patterson, Jake said as he prepared to leave, I may need to come back for more research. This situation might be more serious than anyone realizes. You be careful, Jake, she warned. If Meridian had federal protection 15 years ago, there's no reason to think the protection has ended. These aren't people who appreciate having their secrets exposed. Jake drove home with his mind racing through implications. If Meridian Biotech was still operating, possibly in secret, they had been systematically implanting devices in Cedar Lake pets for months. The question was why. What information could they gather from household pets that justified such an elaborate operation? Scout was still at Elena's clinic, and Jake missed his companion's steady presence. But Scout was safer under professional medical observation while Jake investigated the people who had violated his trust. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. The caller ID showed Marcus Williams. Jake, I need to talk to you. There's been another development. What kind of development? 3 more families called this morning about pets with unusual bumps. That makes at least 8 confirmed cases, and Dr. Vasquez wants to examine all of them. Marcus paused. Jake, what aren't you telling me? Because something's got Elena spooked, and she won't explain what she found in Scout's x-rays. Jake looked at his house, considering how much to reveal. Marcus was his oldest friend and the town sheriff, but Mrs. Patterson's warning echoed in his mind. If Meridian had federal protection, local law enforcement might not be able to help. Meet me at my house in an hour, Jake said. There's something you need to see. Jake spent the hour before Marcus's arrival studying satellite images of the abandoned Meridian facility on his laptop. The aerial views showed several buildings connected by covered walkways. surrounded by a chain-link fence that appeared to be in good repair for an abandoned site. Too good, in fact. When Marcus arrived, Jake led him to the kitchen table where he'd spread out copies of the historical documents from Mrs. Patterson. Meridian Biotech. Jake began without preamble. They operated a research facility north of town from 1990 to 2005. Federal contracts, animal research, and a history of secrecy that matches what we're seeing now. Marcus picked up the newspaper clipping showing the facility's announcement. I remember this place. My father mentioned it occasionally, said they kept to themselves. Had federal authorization that made them off-limits to local law enforcement. Your father never investigated the animal complaints? He tried, but every time he approached the facility, federal agents would appear and send him away. Dad said they had paperwork that made it clear local authorities had no jurisdiction. Marcus set down the clipping and looked at Jake seriously. What did Elena find in Scout's x-rays? Jake pulled up the digital photo he'd taken of the x-ray on his phone. This. Marcus stared at the image for a long moment, his law enforcement training evident in the careful way he studied the details. That's a deliberately implanted electronic device. Elena thinks it's some kind of surveillance equipment. The precision of the placement, the sophisticated design, this isn't amateur work. How many pets are affected? At least 12 that we know of, possibly more. Mrs. Patterson thinks the number could be higher because not everyone brings their pets to the vet for minor issues. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. Jake, if someone is systematically implanting surveillance devices in our pets, this is a federal crime. We're talking about organized conspiracy, unlawful surveillance, possibly violation of bioethics laws. Which brings us back to Meridian. They had federal protection before, but if they still do, even federal agencies can't authorize criminal activity against civilians without due process. But Marcus's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Of that statement, Jake made a decision. I want to visit the abandoned facility. See what's left. Look for evidence that might connect past operations to current activities. Absolutely not. Marcus's response was immediate and firm. If this is connected to federal operations, you could be walking into serious trouble. Let me handle it through official channels. Official channels that told your father to stay away. 15 years ago? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Jake, I understand your concern about Scout, but you're not a law enforcement officer anymore. You're a photographer with a personal stake in this situation. That's exactly the wrong combination for investigating federal conspiracies. Jake knew Marcus was right from a procedural standpoint, but his paramedic training had taught him that sometimes waiting for official processes cost lives. While we're waiting for official channels, more pets are being implanted. More families are being violated. How long do we wait? Long enough to do this right. I'll contact the state police. Maybe the FBI field office in Springfield. Someone with proper authority needs to investigate this. And if they stonewall you the same way they stonewalled your father, Marcus didn't have a good answer for that question. After Marcus left, Jake sat in his quiet house feeling the weight of inaction. Every instinct told him that waiting for official processes would give the conspirators time to cover their tracks, move their operation, or eliminate evidence. In emergency medicine, hesitation killed patients. He called Elena's clinic to check on Scout. He's doing well, she reported. Eating normally, no signs of distress. But Jake, I've been monitoring the device and it appears to be transmitting data. Jake felt a chill. Transmitting what? I don't know. The signals are encrypted, but they're definitely being broadcast on a specific frequency. I contacted a veterinarian friend who has experience with wildlife tracking devices, and she's never seen anything like this. Elena, how difficult would it be to remove the device? Surgically? Not difficult, but risky. The placement suggests it might be connected to nerve pathways or blood vessels. Removing it incorrectly could cause permanent damage. What if we don't remove it? What if Scout keeps carrying it? Elena was quiet for a moment. Jake, if this device is monitoring household conversations or tracking movement patterns, Scout becomes an unwilling spy in your home. Every phone call, every visitor, every private moment could be recorded and transmitted. The violation felt even more personal when described in those terms. Jake's home, his conversations with Tyler, his attempts to rebuild his life, all potentially monitored by strangers with unknown motives. "I'm going to visit the Meridian facility tonight," Jake said. "Jake, that's dangerous. So is doing nothing while more pets get implanted. I need to understand what we're dealing with." That evening, Jake drove north of town along the old lumber road, following directions he'd found in the Historical Society documents. The sun was setting behind the pine trees, casting long shadows across the deserted road. He'd left a detailed note for Marcus explaining his intentions, to be opened if he didn't return by morning. The Meridian facility appeared through the trees like a ghost from another era. The main building was a modernist glass and steel structure that looked oddly pristine for something abandoned 20 years ago. Jake parked his truck behind a stand of pines and approached on foot, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. The chain-link fence was topped with razor wire and appeared to be in excellent repair. Warning signs proclaimed "No trespassing" and "Federal property," but they looked newly printed rather than weather-beaten. Someone was maintaining this supposedly abandoned facility. Jake followed the fence line until he found a section where years of pine needle accumulation had created a natural ramp over a low spot. He climbed carefully, using his jacket to protect against the razor wire, and dropped into the compound. The main building's windows were dark, but Jake noticed that the glass was clean and intact. No broken windows, no graffiti, no signs of vandalism that typically plagued abandoned buildings. He approached cautiously, testing doors and windows. A side entrance near what appeared to be a loading dock had a door that seemed less secure than the others. Jake pulled out the multi-tool he'd carried during his paramedic years, along with the lockpick set he'd learned to use for medical lockouts when patients were trapped. The skills came back easily, and within minutes he was inside. The interior was not what he'd expected from an abandoned building. The hallways were clean. The electrical system was clearly functional based on the emergency lighting, and there was no musty smell of decay. This facility was being maintained, possibly even used. Jake moved quietly through the corridors, photographing everything with his camera's silent mode. Room after room contained sophisticated equipment covered by dust sheets, but the dust looked deliberately applied rather than naturally accumulated. In what appeared to be a laboratory, Jake made his first significant discovery. Examination tables sized for animals, surgical equipment, and monitoring devices that looked far more advanced than typical veterinary tools. He photographed everything, focusing on serial numbers and manufacturer labels. A desk in the corner office contained files that someone had apparently forgotten to secure. Jake opened the top drawer and found documents that made his blood run cold. The letterhead read, "Project Watchtower, Meridian Biotech Division," and was dated just 6 months ago. The documents described Phase 3 implementation of something called Domestic Animal Surveillance Network, with specific references to Cedar Lake as a test population. Jake photographed every page, his hands shaking as he realized the scope of what he was documenting. The project wasn't abandoned. It was ongoing and had been expanded. Cedar Lake residents weren't just being monitored. They were test subjects in an active federal surveillance program. In the bottom drawer, he found something that stopped him cold. A Meridian Biotech employee badge, forgotten in the desk drawer, with a photo of a middle-aged woman identified as Dr. Christine Holloway, senior research scientist. The badge was dated 2004, just before the facility's supposed closure. Jake pocketed the badge and continued his search. In a filing cabinet, he found more recent documents detailing the implantation schedule for Cedar Lake pets. The precision was chilling. Specific animals were targeted based on their owners' professions, social connections, and household routines. His own name appeared on a list dated 3 months ago. Smith, Jacob, former paramedic, divorced, limited social connections. Ideal surveillance candidate through domestic animal vector. They had been watching him since he moved back to Cedar Lake. Scout's implantation wasn't random. It was specifically planned as part of their surveillance of Jake's activities. The sound of vehicles approaching outside sent Jake into hiding behind a laboratory table. Through the window, he watched 2 black SUVs pull up to the main entrance. Men in dark clothing emerged, moving with military precision toward the building. Jake realized with growing horror that the facility wasn't abandoned at all. It was an active operation, and he had walked into the middle of it. Worse, his presence had been detected somehow, possibly through surveillance systems. He hadn't noticed. He needed to escape with the evidence he'd gathered, but the approaching team was already entering the building. Jake could hear voices in the corridor, professional and calm, discussing perimeter breach and containment protocols. Using his knowledge of emergency building layouts from his paramedic training, Jake located a fire exit that led to the rear of the building. He slipped out into the growing darkness, clutching his camera and the stolen employee badge. The return trip to his truck required careful movement through the woods, avoiding the lights and voices of the security team now searching the facility. Jake reached his truck without detection, but as he drove away, he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror, maintaining a steady distance behind him. He was being followed. By the time Jake reached the outskirts of Cedar Lake, the pursuing vehicle had disappeared, but the message was clear. Someone knew he had been at the Meridian facility, knew he had taken photographs, knew he was investigating their operation. Jake parked in his driveway and sat in the truck for several minutes, processing what he had learned. Project Watchtower was real, ongoing, and sophisticated beyond anything he had imagined. Cedar Lake wasn't just being monitored, it was a testing ground for technology that could be deployed anywhere. The employee badge in his pocket represented his first real evidence that Dr. Christine Holloway might still be connected to the operation. Tomorrow, he would need to find her and learn what she knew about Project WATCHTOWER. Tonight, he would document everything he had discovered and prepare for the possibility that his investigation had put him in serious danger. Jake didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table organizing the photographs he'd taken at the Meridian facility, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd uncovered. Project Watchtower wasn't just surveillance, it was a comprehensive study of an entire community, using their beloved pets as unwitting carriers of sophisticated monitoring equipment. By dawn, he had printed copies of the most important documents and hidden them in multiple locations throughout his house. If something happened to him, Marcus would eventually find the evidence. But first, Jake needed to locate Dr. Christine Holloway and understand her role in the continuing operation. The employee badge he'd found provided crucial information. The badge was issued in 2004, just before Meridian's supposed closure, but the plastic was too pristine for something 20 years old. Either Dr. Holloway had taken excellent care of it, or it was much more recent than it appeared. Jake called Elena's clinic to check on Scout, and was relieved to hear his companion was doing well. No changes in the device activity, Elena reported. But Jake, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. If you're right about this being a systematic surveillance operation, we need to document everything carefully. One dog's x-rays aren't enough evidence. I agree. Can you examine the other affected pets? I've already started, Mrs. Henderson. Brought Maggie in yesterday evening, and her x-rays show an identical device. Same placement, same design. I'm scheduling appointments with the other families today. Jake felt a mixture of relief and dread. Elena was helping build the evidence they needed, but each new confirmed case meant more families were being violated. Elena, be careful. I discovered last night that this operation is still active, and the people behind it have resources. What do you mean? Jake explained his infiltration of the Meridian facility, the evidence of ongoing operations, and the security team that had detected his presence. Elena listened in growing horror. Jake, you could have been killed. These people are playing for keeps, which is why we need to understand what we're dealing with before more pets are implanted. After ending the call, Jake began researching Dr. Christine Holloway. Online searches revealed limited information, a brilliant biotech researcher who had published extensively on animal behavior and surveillance technology through the late 1990s, then had seemingly disappeared from academic circles around 2005. But one detail caught Jake's attention. Dr. Holloway had owned property in Cedar Lake, a house on the far shore of the lake. Purchased in 1995, public records showed the property was still in her name, though listed as unoccupied for tax purposes. Jake drove to the address. A modest cabin tucked among pine trees on a quiet stretch of lakeshore. The building appeared abandoned, with overgrown landscaping and boarded windows. But Jake's paramedic training had taught him to look beyond surface appearances. The property showed subtle signs of recent maintenance, fresh caulking around the foundation, newly replaced roof shingles, a driveway cleared of debris despite the cabin's abandoned appearance. Someone was maintaining this property while making it look uninhabited. Jake parked at a nearby hiking trail and approached the cabin on foot. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock, but a rear window had been left slightly open for ventilation. Using his multi-tool, Jake carefully removed the window screen and climbed inside. The interior was a revelation. While the outside appeared abandoned, the cabin was furnished and obviously inhabited. Research papers covered every surface. Sophisticated computer equipment hummed quietly in a makeshift office, and walls were lined with photographs and documents. Related to Project WATCHTOWER, Dr. Christine Holloway had been living here all along, continuing her research in secret. Jake photographed everything, focusing on recent documents that showed the evolution of Project Watchtower from animal behavior studies to comprehensive surveillance network. The papers revealed that the original program had been shut down in 2005 due to ethical concerns raised by Dr. Holloway herself, but had been secretly restarted under different federal authorization 5 years ago. In a locked desk drawer opened. With his lockpick set, Jake found Dr. Holloway's research journal. The entries revealed a woman tortured by guilt over her role in developing surveillance technology that was being misused. Her final entries from 2005 described her attempts to expose the program's ethical violations and her forced resignation when federal authorities threatened to prosecute her for breaching security agreements. But the most recent entries, dated just weeks ago, showed that Dr. Holloway had been monitoring the restart of Project Watchtower and documenting its expansion. She knew about the current pet implantations and was gathering evidence to expose the program again. The last journal entry was particularly disturbing. They know I'm watching. Security sweeps have increased, and I've detected surveillance on my property. If something happens to me, the evidence is hidden where only someone who understands the original research would think to look. The truth must come out before they expand beyond Cedar Lake. Jake realized he might be too late. Dr. Holloway could be in hiding, captured, or worse. But her reference to hidden evidence suggested she had prepared for this possibility. A noise outside froze Jake in place. Footsteps on the cabin's front porch, multiple people moving with military precision. Through the window, He saw the same black SUVs from the Meridian facility. Jake grabbed Dr. Holloway's journal and moved toward the rear window he'd used to enter. Voices outside indicated the security team was preparing to enter the cabin. They knew someone was inside. As Jake climbed through the window, he heard the front door being forced open. He ran toward his truck, crashing through the underbrush as voices behind him shouted orders to search the perimeter. The drive back to town was tense, with Jake constantly checking his mirrors for pursuit. The security team had found him at the cabin just as they had at the Meridian facility. Either they were monitoring his movements somehow, or they had resources that allowed them to track his investigation in real time. Back at his house, Jake read through Dr. Holloway's journal more carefully. Her entries revealed not just the technical details of Project Watchtower, but the human cost of systematic surveillance. Families whose private conversations were recorded, individuals whose movements were tracked, children whose activities were monitored through their pets implanted devices. The program's scope was staggering. Cedar Lake was just one of several test communities where the technology was being refined before wider deployment. Success here would mean similar operations in towns across the country. But Dr. Holloway's journal also revealed weaknesses in the system. The devices had limited battery life, required regular data transmission, and depended on a central monitoring station that was vulnerable to disruption. Jake's phone rang, interrupting his reading. The caller ID showed Marcus Williams. "Jake, where are you? I've been trying to reach you all morning. I'm home." "Why?" "Because Dr. Elena Vasquez called in a report that concerned me. She says you broke into the old Meridian facility last night and discovered evidence of ongoing operations." Jake hesitated. Marcus was his oldest friend, but Dr. Holloway's journal had mentioned federal agents and security sweeps. Trust was becoming a luxury he couldn't afford. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Did your department receive any federal requests for information about my activities?" The pause on the other end of the line lasted too long. "Jake, I think we need to talk in person." Jake agreed to meet Marcus at the sheriff's office. But first he made a crucial decision. Dr. Holloway's journal mentioned evidence hidden where only someone who understands the original research would think to look. Jake had one idea where that might be. He returned to Dr. Holloway's abandoned cabin, this time approaching from the lakeside using a kayak he borrowed from his neighbor. The security team had left, but Jake suspected they might return, so he worked quickly. In Dr. Holloway's makeshift laboratory, Jake studied the research equipment more carefully. Hidden behind a false panel in an antique jewelry box, he found what she had left behind, an encrypted USB drive, small but potentially containing everything needed to expose Project WATCHTOWER. The drive was protected by military-grade encryption, but it came with handwritten instructions in Dr. Holloway's careful script. For emergency decryption, contact Deputy Sarah Chung, Cedar Lake Sheriff's Department. She has the key phrase. Jake stared at the note. Deputy Chung was Marcus's newest hire, a young woman who had recently transferred from the state police. If Dr. Holloway trusted her with decryption information, she might be the only law enforcement officer in Cedar Lake who wasn't compromised. Jake pocketed the USB drive and returned to town, but instead of going directly to the sheriff's office, he stopped at the small apartment complex where Deputy Chung lived. Sarah Chung answered her door in civilian clothes, looking surprised to see him. "Mr. Smith, is everything all right?" Jake showed her the USB drive and Dr. Holloway's note. Deputy Chun's expression grew serious as she read the instructions. "How did you get this?" "Dr. Christine Holloway left it for someone she trusted. She specifically mentioned your name." Deputy Chen invited Jake inside and examined the drive more carefully. "I met Dr. Holloway about 6 months ago. She approached me privately, said she had concerns about federal operations in Cedar Lake that might require someone outside the normal chain of command. What did she tell you? That there was a surveillance program operating without proper oversight, using local animals as monitoring devices. She said if anything happened to her, someone would need to decrypt evidence she was gathering. Deputy Chun connected the drive to her personal laptop. She gave me a key phrase that would unlock her files. As the decryption process ran, Deputy Chun explained that she had been quietly investigating unusual federal activity in the area for months. There have been budget allocations for operations that don't appear in any official records, personnel movements that don't match stated purposes, equipment purchases that seem excessive for a rural sheriff's department. The files began appearing on the laptop screen, and both Jake and Deputy Chun stared in growing horror at what Dr. Holloway had documented. Video files showed disturbing experiments on animals, researchers discussing the ethical implications of unauthorized surveillance, and Dr. Holloway herself recording final messages about the program's true scope. "This is incredible," Deputy Chun whispered. She documented everything: the original program, its shutdown, the secret restart, and the current operations. One video file was particularly damning. It showed a meeting between federal officials and local authorities, including someone who looked remarkably like Sheriff Marcus Williams, discussing payment arrangements for keeping Project Watchtower secret. Jake felt sick. Marcus has been compromised from the beginning. "It's worse than that," Deputy Chun said, pointing to another file. "Look at this." The document detailed a cleanup protocol to be implemented if Project Watchtower was ever discovered. The protocol involved eliminating evidence, relocating operations, and ensuring that anyone who had uncovered the program was discredited or neutralized. "Jake, Dr. Holloway's final message says the cleanup protocol has been activated. Your investigation triggered it." Jake realized the full scope of his danger. Not only was he being watched, but there were people with federal authority who had decided he needed to be stopped permanently. "We need to get this information to someone who can act on it," Jake said. "Someone outside the local chain of command." "I have contacts at the state attorney general's office," Deputy Chun offered. "People I trust from my previous assignment." As they prepared to copy the files, Jake's phone rang. Marcus again. "Jake, where are you? We need to talk about your activities. Last night, there have been complaints filed about trespassing on federal property." "I'll be there soon," Jake said, ending the call quickly. Deputy Chun looked worried. "You can't go to the sheriff's office. If Marcus is compromised, you're walking into a trap." "I know. But if I don't show up, he'll know something is wrong. I need to buy us time to get this evidence to your contacts." They agreed that Deputy Chun would immediately begin the process of contacting state authorities, while Jake kept Marcus occupied. It was dangerous, but their only chance of exposing Project Watchtower before the cleanup. Protocol eliminated all evidence. Jake drove to the sheriff's office with Dr. Holloway's research, journal hidden under his truck seat, and the most damning photographs printed and sealed in an envelope addressed to Tyler. If something happened to him, at least his son would know the truth. Marcus was waiting in his office, but he wasn't alone. Two men in dark suits sat in chairs flanking Marcus's desk. Federal agents, Jake realized, with the unmistakable bearing of people accustomed to intimidating civilians. "Jake, these gentlemen are from the Department of Homeland Security," Marcus said. His voice was strained, suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. "They have some questions about your activities." The older agent spoke without introducing himself. "Mr. Smith, you've been observed on federal property without authorization. That's a serious crime. I was photographing abandoned buildings for a project about local history." "The Meridian facility isn't abandoned, Mr. Smith. It's an active federal operation, and you've compromised national security by your unauthorized presence. Jake realized this was the moment Dr. Holloway had written about in her journal, when federal authority would be used to silence anyone who discovered Project Watchtower. But knowledge was power, and Jake still had cards to play. "I'm curious," Jake said, looking directly at Marcus. "How long have you known about the surveillance devices being implanted in our pets?" Marcus's expression didn't change, but Jake caught a flicker of guilt in his old friend's eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. The federal agent leaned forward. "Mr. Smith, you're going to turn over any photographs or documents you obtained during your illegal activities, and you're going to sign a statement acknowledging that you violated federal security protocols. And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to treat you as a threat to national security. The penalties for that are quite severe." Jake looked at his childhood friend, the man he trusted with his life during their teenage adventures, the person he'd turned to when his marriage fell apart. Marcus couldn't meet his eyes. "Marcus," Jake said quietly, "they're using our animals to spy on us. They're violating every family in this town. How much did they pay you to look the other way?" The silence in Marcus's office stretched uncomfortably long. The federal agents waited for Jake's compliance. Marcus stared at his desk, and Jake realized that his oldest friendship was about to be destroyed by the truth he was forcing into the open. "I've been protecting this town for 20 years, Marcus finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When they approached me, they said it was temporary. Just a few years of cooperation while they tested new security technology." 20 years? Jake's voice rose. "Marcus, Project Watchtower has been running for 20 years. The older federal agent shot Marcus a warning look, but Marcus was past caring about security protocols. It started small, just monitoring communication patterns, tracking movement in and out of town. They said it was anti-terrorism research, protecting rural communities from infiltration." Jake felt the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity, but it expanded. Every few years, they added new capabilities. First, it was just electronic monitoring of phone and internet traffic. Then they wanted to track individuals more precisely. The animal implantation program started 5 years ago as a way to monitor household activities without needing search warrants. The younger federal agent stood up. "Sheriff Williams, you're revealing classified information to an unauthorized civilian." "Shut up," Marcus snapped, showing more backbone than Jake had seen from him in days. "I'm tired of carrying your secrets." Marcus opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick file folder. "Jake, I've been documenting everything they've asked me to do. Every payment, every cover-up, every time I've had to lie to families in this town. I kept records because I knew someday I'd need them." Jake stared at his friend in amazement. "You've been building evidence against them? For years?" "At first, I thought I could control how far it went, limit the damage to the community. But they kept expanding the program, and I realized I was just helping them perfect the system that would eventually be used everywhere." The older agent's hand moved toward his jacket, but Marcus was faster. The sheriff's service weapon was out and pointed at the federal agents before they could react. "Gentlemen, you're going to sit back down and listen to what I have to say." Jake watched in fascination as Marcus transformed from compromised local sheriff to someone taking a stand. "Marcus, what are you doing?" "What I should have done 15 years ago." Marcus kept his weapon trained on the agents while addressing Jake. "The real Project Watchtower isn't about surveillance technology. It's about control. They've been testing how much privacy violation a community will accept before people start to resist." "Testing? Cedar Lake is a control group, Jake. We're lab rats in an experiment designed to see how surveillance can be implemented in rural communities without triggering organized resistance." Marcus's voice carried years of suppressed guilt. They've been watching how people adapt to being monitored, how families change their behavior when they suspect they're being observed, how community trust breaks down under systematic surveillance. The younger agent spoke carefully. "Sheriff, you're making serious allegations that could what? Could what? Ruin my career? Destroy my reputation?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "You people destroyed my career the day you turned me into a collaborator. I've spent 20 years watching neighbors and friends, filing false reports, covering up crimes against my own community." Jake began to understand the full scope of what they were facing. The pet implantations are just the latest phase. They're the most sophisticated phase. The devices don't just monitor, they can influence behavior. Low-level electromagnetic pulses that affect animal nervous systems, which in turn affect household dynamics. They're literally experimenting with mind control using our pets as the delivery system. Jake thought about Scout's recent behavioral changes, periods of unusual lethargy followed by hyperactivity, changes in his normal routines that Jake had attributed to adjusting to their new home. They've been manipulating Scout's behavior? All the implanted animals. They're testing how behavioral changes in pets can be used to influence family relationships, community interactions, even political attitudes. The federal agents were growing increasingly agitated, but Marcus kept them covered while continuing his explanation. The ultimate goal is to deploy this technology nationwide. Rural communities first, because we're isolated and less likely to have resources for investigation. Then suburban areas, finally urban implementation. "Marcus," the older agent said in a threatening tone, "you're committing treason by revealing classified security operations." "I'm committing treason by participating in them," Marcus shot back. "This isn't national security. This is social engineering on a massive scale." Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Deputy Chun. "Files uploaded to State Edge F. BI contacted. Get out now." Marcus saw Jake check his phone. "Good news?" "Deputy Chun has the evidence from Dr. Holloway's files. She's contacted federal authorities. Outside this operation, then we might actually have a chance." Marcus made a decision. "Jake, take my evidence files and go. These gentlemen and I are going to have a conversation about the difference between national security and criminal conspiracy. I'm not leaving you alone with them. You have to. Someone needs to make sure this information reaches people who can act on it." Marcus tossed Jake the thick file folder. "Everything's documented. Payments, orders, cover-up instructions. Enough to prosecute everyone involved in this program." Jake grabbed the folder and headed for the door, but the older agent's voice stopped. "Mr. Smith, if you leave this office with classified materials, you'll be hunted by every federal agency in the country. Your son Tyler will be placed under investigation as a potential security threat. Your ex-wife will lose her job due to security concerns about her association with you." Jake felt ice in his veins. They knew about Tyler, about Sarah. The surveillance had been comprehensive enough to map his entire personal network. "That's how they maintain control," Marcus said grimly. "They threaten everyone you care about until cooperation seems like the only option to protect your family. But you're taking a stand now, because I finally realized that protecting individuals by enabling the system just guarantees the system will eventually destroy everyone." Marcus's resolve was absolute. "Go, Jake. Make sure this ends here." Jake left the sheriff's office clutching Marcus's evidence files, knowing that his friend was probably sacrificing his freedom to give Jake a head start. The parking lot was empty, except for the federal agent's black SUV and Marcus's patrol car. But Jake suspected more agents were nearby. As he drove home, Jake's mind raced through the implications of what Marcus had revealed. Project Watchtower wasn't just surveillance. It was a comprehensive program to test social control methods on an unwitting population. Cedar Lake residents weren't just being watched. They were being systematically manipulated to study their Responses to various forms of psychological pressure. The pet implantation program was the most sophisticated element yet developed, but it was only the beginning. Success in Cedar Lake would mean deployment of similar programs in communities across the country, creating a network of monitored and manipulated populations under federal control. Jake parked in his driveway and sat in his truck for a moment, processing the magnitude of what he'd learned. Scout wasn't just carrying a surveillance device. He was carrying technology designed to influence Jake's own behavior and emotional state. Every interaction with his beloved companion had potentially been manipulated by people studying the results. The violation felt complete and overwhelming. Not just his privacy, but his relationships, his emotions. Even his love for his dog had been turned into data points in a federal research program. But Marcus had given him something more valuable than evidence. He'd given him hope. The sheriff's willingness to finally take a stand proved that even people who had been compromised could choose to fight back. And Deputy Chun's success in contacting outside authorities meant the conspiracy was no longer hidden. Jake gathered Marcus's files and headed into his house, knowing that everything depended on the next few hours. If they could expose Project Watchtower before the cleanup protocol eliminated all evidence, they might save not just Cedar Lake, but countless other communities from becoming unwilling test subjects in a program that treated American citizens as laboratory animals. Jake spread Marcus's evidence files across his kitchen table, his paramedic training helping him organize the information systematically. 20 years of documentation revealed a conspiracy so comprehensive that it took his breath away. Payment, schedules, surveillance targets, behavioral modification protocols, and detailed reports on how Cedar Lake residents responded to various forms of psychological manipulation. But one document made him stop cold. A list titled Phase 4 Implementation, Target Elimination included his own name, along with Dr. Elena Vasquez, Deputy Sarah Chung, and several other residents who had asked too many questions about their pet's health. Jake's phone rang. Elena's name appeared on the caller ID. Jake, where are you? I've been trying to reach you for hours. I'm home. Elena, listen carefully. We're all in danger. The people behind this program have decided to eliminate anyone who might expose them. No. 2 federal agents came to my clinic an hour ago. They wanted to confiscate all my x-rays and files related to the pet implantations. When I refused, they said they'd return with a warrant and shut down my practice permanently. Jake felt time running out. Where are you now? At the clinic. I'm trying to remove the devices from as many animals as possible before they can stop. Jake, the surgery is more complex than I initially thought. The devices are integrated with nervous system pathways. It's delicate work. How many animals have you treated? 3 so far. Scout is ready for surgery, but I need at least 4 more hours to work on the others safely. Jake made a decision. Elena, pack up everything, all your equipment, files, x-rays, everything related to this case. We're going to find somewhere safe to work. Where? If they can intimidate local law enforcement, they can find us anywhere in town. Jake thought about the abandoned Meridian facility. The federal agents assumed it was secure, but Jake knew ways in and out that their security hadn't detected. I have an idea, but it's risky. Everything's risky now. 20 minutes later, Jake met Elena at her clinic. She had packed surgical equipment, files, and Scout into her veterinary van, working with the efficiency of someone who understood the stakes. Scout looked groggy from the pre-surgical medication, but alert enough to recognize Jake. How is he? Jake asked, gently petting Scout's head. The device appears to be affecting his nervous system more than the others. Maybe because he's been implanted longer, or maybe because the targeting was more specific. Elena's voice carried professional concern mixed with anger. Jake, what they've done to these animals is criminal. Not just the implantation, but the ongoing manipulation. I can see evidence of behavioral modification in all of them. They drove in convoy toward the Meridian facility, taking back roads to avoid detection. Jake had studied the building's layout during his previous infiltration and knew that the medical wing had equipment that Elena could adapt for the complex surgeries. "This is insane," Elena said as they parked behind the facility. "We're about to perform surgery in an abandoned building that's probably under surveillance." "It's the last place they'll expect us to go," Jake replied, though he shared her concerns. "And the medical equipment there is more sophisticated than what we'd have anywhere else." They carried Scout and Elena's equipment through the same fire exit Jake had used before. The facility seemed deserted, but Jake remained alert for signs of security presence. In the medical wing, Elena quickly assessed the available equipment. "This is actually perfect," she said with surprise. "Whoever designed this facility spared no expense on the surgical suite. I can work with this." Jake helped Elena prepare for Scout surgery while monitoring the facility's entrances through security cameras that were still functional. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were using Project Watchtower's own equipment to rescue its victims. As Elena began the delicate process of removing Scout's implant, Jake received a text from Deputy Chun. "State authorities en route. Federal. Backup called. Things moving fast. Elena, how much more time do you need?" "At least 2 hours for Scout, then another hour each for the other animals." Jake did the math. If federal reinforcements were arriving, they might not have enough time to complete the surgery safely. But leaving the devices implanted meant leaving the animals under continuing manipulation and their owners under surveillance. "We stick to the plan," Jake decided. "Save as many as we can." Elena worked with steady precision, her veterinary training evident in every careful movement. Jake watched the monitors, tracked the facility's security status, and tried not to think about what would happen if they were discovered before completing the surgeries. "Jake," Elena said without looking up from her work, "I need you to understand something. Even if we remove all these devices successfully, the people behind this program will just start over somewhere else. We're treating the symptoms, not the disease." "What do you mean?" "Project Watchtower isn't just about Cedar Lake. It's a testing ground for technology that will be deployed nationwide. Stopping it here might slow them down, but it won't end the program." Jake realized she was right. Saving Cedar Lake's pets was important, but it wouldn't prevent similar programs from being implemented in other communities. They needed to do more than rescue the current victims. They needed to expose the entire system. "Elena, what if we don't just remove the devices? What if we reprogram them?" She looked up from Scout's surgery. "Reprogram them to do what?" "To broadcast evidence of what they've been used for. Turn their own surveillance network against them." Elena considered the idea while continuing her delicate work. "The devices are sophisticated enough to record and transmit audio. If we could modify their programming, we might be able to broadcast confessions, evidence, anything that would expose the program. Can you do it?" "I'm a veterinarian, not a computer programmer, but..." She paused her surgery and looked at the device she'd partially removed from Scout. "These things are designed to interface with nervous systems. If I could access their programming protocols, I might be able to change their transmission parameters." Jake felt hope stirring. Instead of just treating the victims of Project Watchtower, they could turn the program's own technology into the weapon that destroyed it. "What do you need?" "Access to their central monitoring station. The devices are controlled remotely, so there has to be a command center somewhere in this facility." Jake remembered seeing a communications room during his previous infiltration. "I think I know where that is." While Elena continued Scout surgery, Jake explored the facility's communications wing. Banks of monitors showed feeds from throughout Cedar Lake Street cameras. Traffic monitoring even some residential surveillance that must have been installed without residents' knowledge. But the most disturbing display showed real-time data from implanted devices. Dozens of pets throughout Cedar Lake were being monitored simultaneously, their locations tracked, their physiological responses recorded, their behavioral patterns analyzed. Jake photographed everything, building evidence of the program's scope while searching for the central control system. In a secured room behind the main communications center, he found what Elena needed, the master programming station that controlled all implanted devices. The system was more sophisticated than anything Jake had encountered, but the basic principles were similar to emergency medical equipment he'd worked with as a paramedic. Input commands, monitor responses, adjust parameters based on feedback. "Elena, I found the control system." She appeared beside him minutes later, having completed Scout surgery successfully. "The device is out, and Scout is stable," she reported. "Now let's see if we can turn their own system against them." Elena studied the programming interface with the analytical mind that had made her an excellent veterinarian. "This is elegant," she admitted grudgingly. "Evil, but elegant. The devices can be programmed to influence behavior through electromagnetic stimulation, record audio through embedded microphones, and transmit data to multiple receiving stations. Can you reprogram them to broadcast evidence instead of surveillance data? Better than that. I can program them to transmit everything they've recorded. Every conversation they've monitored, every household activity they've documented, every piece of evidence that proves this program's existence." Jake realized the full potential of what she was suggesting. "You mean broadcast the evidence through the devices still implanted in pets throughout town?" "Exactly. Instead of just exposing Project Watchtower, we can use their own surveillance network to deliver proof of their crimes directly to every household in Cedar Lake." Elena's fingers moved across the control interface with growing confidence. "Jake, this system is connected to multiple government databases. If I can access their files, we might be able to expose similar programs operating in other locations." "Do it." As Elena worked to reprogram the surveillance network, Jake monitored the facility's security. His phone showed multiple missed calls from Tyler, and his chest tightened with worry about his son's safety. "Elena, I need to call Tyler. The federal agents threatened him if I didn't cooperate. Make it quick. I need about 10 more minutes to complete the reprogramming." Jake called his son, praying the federal agents hadn't already acted on their threats. Dad, is that you?" "There are weird guys watching our house. Mom's scared." Jake's worst fears were confirmed. "Tyler, listen to me carefully. Take your mother and go to your grandmother's house in Springfield. Right now. Don't pack anything. Just leave immediately." "Dad, what's happening?" "Mom says you're in some kind of trouble with the government. I'm trying to expose people who have been doing very bad things to our community. But I need you and your mother to be safe while I finish this." "Are you in danger?" Jake looked around the facility where he and Elena were using stolen federal equipment to reprogram a surveillance network that had been violating an entire town for 20 years. "Yes, but I'm not alone. And Tyler, I love you." "When this is over, I'll explain everything." "I love you too, Dad. Be careful." Jake ended the call with his heart aching. For the first time in months, Tyler had said he loved him, but it might be the last conversation they ever had. "Jake." Elena called from the control station. "It's working. The reprogramming is complete. What happens now?" Elena's smile was fierce with satisfaction. "Now we activate every implanted device in Cedar Lake simultaneously and broadcast 20 years of surveillance evidence directly to the families who were victimized. Every recorded conversation, every monitored activity, every piece of proof that this program exists." Jake realized they were about to turn Project Watchtower's greatest strength into its ultimate weakness. The comprehensive surveillance that was supposed to maintain secrecy would instead expose the entire conspiracy to its victims. Elena, you're a genius. I'm a veterinarian who's very angry about what they did to innocent animals. Her finger hovered over the activation control. Ready? Jake thought about Scout, recovering from surgery in the next room. About Tyler and Sarah, hopefully escaping to safety. About Marcus, who had sacrificed his freedom to give them this chance. About Dr. Holloway, whose evidence had made this moment possible. Do it. Elena pressed the activation control, and every monitor in the communications room lit up with activity. Across Cedar Lake, dozens of implanted devices began broadcasting simultaneously. But instead of sending surveillance data to federal monitors, they were transmitting evidence of Project Watchtower directly to local emergency frequencies. Police scanners and even radio stations within range. Jake watched the data streams with amazement. Elena, what exactly are we broadcasting? Everything. 20 years of recorded conversations between federal agents and local collaborators. Audio files of residents' private moments that were illegally monitored. Documentation of behavioral manipulation experiments. Video evidence from Dr. Holloway's research. All of it being transmitted on frequencies that emergency responders, media outlets, and technically minded residents will detect. Through the facility's windows, Jake could see lights coming on throughout Cedar Lake as residents received the shocking transmissions. Phone lines would be ringing, social media would be exploding with shared audio files, and emergency services would be overwhelmed with calls from citizens who were finally learning what had been done to them. Jake, look at this. Elena pointed to one of the monitors showing real-time responses to their broadcast. The devices are picking up conversations from households that are receiving the transmissions. People are angry. Really angry. Jake listened to fragments of outraged conversations coming through the implanted devices. They've been listening to us for 20 years. Our own sheriff was involved. They used our pets to spy on our families. The communications rooms. Phone system began ringing constantly as federal monitors tried to regain control of their compromised network. Elena ignored the incoming calls while continuing to broadcast evidence. How long can we maintain the transmission? Jake asked. As long as the devices have power. But Jake, look at the external security cameras. Jake turned to the monitors showing the facility's perimeter. Multiple vehicles were approaching from different directions. Federal agents, state police, and what appeared to be civilian vehicles filled with angry Cedar Lake residents who had heard the broadcasts were about to have company from multiple directions. Elena continued working at the control station, uploading additional evidence files from Dr. Holloway's research. I need 5 more minutes to complete the full data dump. Everything from the original experiments through the current manipulation programs. Jake monitored the approaching vehicles. Elena, we may not have 5 minutes. The first vehicles to reach the facility weren't federal agents. They were Cedar Lake residents. Jake recognized Bill Henderson's pickup truck, followed by cars driven by other pet owners who had been directly affected by the implantation program. Through the facility's intercom system, Jake could hear Bill Henderson's voice. We know you're in there. We want answers about what you did to our animals. More vehicles arrived, and Jake realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. An entire community rising up against the federal program that had violated their privacy and manipulated their lives for 2 decades. Elena, the town is surrounding the facility. They heard the broadcasts. She looked up from her work with satisfaction. Good. Let them hear everything. 20 years of lies and manipulation deserve 20 years' worth of angry response. Federal agents were arriving now, but they found themselves vastly outnumbered by residents who had just learned the truth about Project Watchtower. Jake watched. through the security cameras as agents tried to establish a perimeter around the facility, only to be confronted by increasingly angry crowds of people, demanding explanations. Mrs. Henderson was shouting at a federal agent. "You put a device in my dog. You've been listening to my family for months. How dare you?" The scene was chaotic but also inspiring. Cedar Lake residents, who had been unwitting victims for 20 years, were finally confronting their tormentors with the evidence of their own surveillance playing on every radio and emergency scanner in town. "Jake," Elena called out urgently, "I'm detecting movement inside the facility. Someone else is here." Jake checked the internal security cameras and saw armed figures moving through the corridors toward their location. The cleanup protocol was being implemented. Federal agents were entering the facility to eliminate the evidence and anyone who had accessed it. "How much more time do you need?" 3 minutes to upload the final files. These contain the locations of other test sites and the names of everyone involved in the program nationwide. Jake could hear footsteps in the corridor outside the communications room. "Elena, they're almost here." She worked frantically at the control station while Jake positioned himself near the door. His paramedic training included basic defensive tactics, but he was facing professional agents with military equipment. "Got it," Elena announced. "The complete database is now broadcasting to every device in the network. Jake, this evidence will reach federal law enforcement agencies, congressional offices, and media outlets across the country." The door to the communications room burst open, and 3 armed agents entered with weapons drawn. Jake and Elena raised their hands, but Elena's laptop continued uploading data to the compromised surveillance network. "Step away from the equipment," the lead agent ordered. Elena complied, but the damage was done. Every implanted device in Cedar Lake, and according to the network mapping, similar devices in dozens of other communities, was broadcasting evidence of Project Watchtower to anyone capable of receiving the transmissions. Outside, the crowd of angry residents was growing larger and more vocal. Jake could hear chants of 20 years of lies. "And our pets aren't spies." The lead agent spoke into his radio. "Control, we have the subjects in custody, but the data breach is extensive. Recommend immediate implementation of federal emergency protocols." Jake realized that Elena's plan had worked better than they'd hoped. They had turned Project Watchtower's own surveillance network into a nationwide broadcast system exposing federal crimes. Even if they were arrested, the evidence was already in the hands of victims, journalists, and law enforcement agencies across the country. "Elena," Jake said quietly as the agents secured their hands with zip ties, "I think we just ended Project Watchtower." "Not just Project Watchtower," she replied with a grim smile. "We ended the entire program. Every test site, every collaborator, every victim now has access to the evidence they need." The federal agents were preparing to escort Jake and Elena from the facility when Deputy Sarah Chun's voice echoed through the building's intercom system. "Federal agents inside the Meridian facility. This is Deputy Chun, Cedar Lake Sheriff's Department. You are surrounded by state and federal authorities responding to evidence of criminal conspiracy. Exit the building with your hands visible." Jake exchanged a look with Elena. Chun had succeeded in bringing outside law enforcement to Cedar Lake, but the timing couldn't have been more critical. The lead agent spoke into his radio again, but received only static in response. Elena's reprogramming of the communications network had apparently disrupted their ability to coordinate with their command structure. "Sir," one of the younger agents said nervously, "we're not getting any response from control. And those crowds outside are getting larger." Through the facility's windows, Jake could see that Cedar Lake residents had been joined by news crews, state police vehicles, and federal agents who appeared to be from different agencies than the ones holding them captive. Mrs. Chun appeared. In several security camera feeds throughout the facility, leading teams of investigators toward their location. But more importantly, Jake spotted a familiar figure among the law enforcement officers, Dr. Christine Holloway, very much alive and apparently working with the authorities. Elena, look at camera feed 7. Dr. Holloway is here. Elena's eyes widened. She's not dead or missing. She's been working with federal investigators to expose this program. The lead agent holding them noticed their attention to the monitors and turned to see what they were watching. His expression grew increasingly grim as he recognized Dr. Holloway among the approaching investigators. "Control, we have a problem," he said into his radio, but still received no response. The door to the communications room opened again. But this time, it was Deputy Chun leading a team of state investigators. She looked relieved to see Jake and Elena alive, though secured by zip ties. "Mr. Smith, Dr. Vasquez, are you injured?" "We're fine," Jake replied. But these agents were implementing some kind of cleanup protocol. Dr. Christine Holloway entered behind the state investigators, looking older than her employee photo but carrying herself with the authority of someone who had finally found allies powerful enough to confront Project Watchtower. "Gentlemen," she said to the federal agents, "I'm Dr. Christine Holloway, the original researcher who designed the surveillance technology you've been misusing for the past 20 years. Thanks to Mr. Smith and Dr. Vasquez, we now have complete documentation of how my research was perverted into an illegal surveillance program." The lead agent tried to maintain authority. "Dr. Holloway, you're interfering with a classified federal operation." "There is no classified federal operation," Dr. Holloway interrupted firmly. Project Watchtower was terminated in 2005 due to ethical violations and constitutional concerns. What you've been running is an illegal surveillance program that violated federal law, constitutional rights, and international agreements on human experimentation. Deputy Chun cut Jake and Elena's restraints while state investigators began securing the federal agents. "Jake, Dr. Vasquez, you need to know that your broadcast worked beyond anything we hoped for. The evidence has reached congressional oversight. Committees, federal prosecutors in multiple districts, and media outlets nationwide." Elena rubbed her wrists where the zip ties had been. "What about the other test sites?" "Simultaneous raids are being conducted in 17 locations across 6 states, Dr. Holloway explained. "The network you compromised provided us with real-time intelligence on the entire program. Every facility, every collaborator, every victim community is being contacted by appropriate authorities." Jake felt a surge of relief mixed with amazement. "What about the people who were threatened? My son, other families?" "Federal marshals are providing protection for all threatened individuals," Deputy Chun assured him. "Tyler and your ex-wife are safe. Sheriff Williams is in federal custody, but he's being treated as a cooperating witness rather than a primary suspect." Dr. Holloway approached the control station where Elena had worked to reprogram the surveillance network. "Dr. Vasquez, what you accomplished here was brilliant. You turned 20 years of illegal surveillance into evidence that will prosecute everyone involved in this program." "What happens to the animals?" Elena asked. "The pets that are still implanted? We're coordinating with veterinarians nationwide to safely remove all devices. The technology you developed for scout surgery is being shared with emergency veterinary teams at every affected location." Jake looked around the communications room that had been the heart of Project Watchtower's operations. Monitors that had once displayed illegal surveillance of innocent families now showed news broadcasts about the program's exposure. The very technology designed to maintain secrecy had become the weapon that destroyed the conspiracy. "Dr. Holloway," Jake said, "what made you decide to come forward now?" She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had waited 20 years for justice. "Mr. Smith, I never stopped fighting this program. When it was officially terminated in 2005, I thought, we'd won. But when I discovered it had been restarted under different authorization, I began documenting everything while working with federal investigators to build a case that would stand up in court. You've been undercover for 15 years? Working to expose the people who perverted my research into a tool for violating constitutional rights. Your investigation provided the final evidence we needed to move from surveillance to prosecution. Elena looked at the monitors showing Cedar Lake. Residents celebrating in the streets as news of the program's exposure spread. What happens to our community now? Now you heal, Dr. Holloway said simply. You rebuild trust. You take care of your pets, and you help other communities understand what was done to them. But most importantly, you prove that even the most sophisticated surveillance program can't survive when ordinary people refuse to accept violation of their rights. Jake thought about Scout, recovering from surgery and finally free of the device that had turned him into an unwilling spy. About Tyler, who was safe and might finally understand why his father had taken such dangerous risks. About Cedar Lake, which would never be the same, but might emerge stronger from this experience. Outside, the sound of celebration mixed with the organized activity of law enforcement securing evidence. Project Watchtower was over, but the work of healing and justice was just beginning. 6 months later, Jake stood at the edge of Cedar Lake with Scout and Tyler, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and amber. It was the same spot where he'd taken his morning walks during the darkest period of his life. But everything was different now. Scout trotted along the shoreline, his energy fully restored after Elena's surgery. The small scar where the device had been removed was barely visible beneath his thick coat, but more importantly, his behavior was completely his own again. No more unexplained lethargy, no more strange behavioral changes, just the natural enthusiasm of a healthy German shepherd exploring his territory. Dad, Mrs. Patterson wants to interview you again for the Historical Society, Tyler said, skipping stones across the calm water. She's creating a permanent exhibit about Project Watchtower. Jake smiled at the mention of the elderly librarian who had become something of a local hero. Her meticulous record-keeping and willingness to help Jake's investigation had played a crucial role in exposing the conspiracy. The Cedar Lake Historical Society now housed the most complete documentation of Project Watchtower available anywhere, serving as a resource for researchers, journalists, and other communities that had been affected by similar programs. What does she want to know this time? How it feels to be back to normal life. Tyler threw another stone, achieving an impressive skip count, though I guess nothing's really normal anymore. Tyler was right. Cedar Lake bore little resemblance to the quiet community Jake had returned to 18 months ago. Federal investigators had spent weeks documenting the scope of surveillance, interviewing residents, and coordinating with similar investigations nationwide. Media attention had been intense, but ultimately beneficial, bringing resources and support that helped the community heal. The abandoned Meridian facility had been converted into a transparency center, where visitors could learn about surveillance overreach and constitutional rights. Dr. Holloway directed the center, using her expertise to educate people about protecting themselves from future violations of privacy. Your photography exhibition is opening next week, Tyler reminded him. Are you nervous? Jake's photography had evolved since the Project Watchtower investigation. His new series, titled The Truth About Cedar Lake, combined his nature photography with documentation of the community's recovery. The images captured both the beauty of their lakeside town and the resilience of people who had survived systematic violation of their privacy. A little nervous, Jake admitted. It's different when your work carries that kind of responsibility. The exhibition was touring nationally, helping other communities understand what to look for if they suspected surveillance programs in their areas. Jake had never intended to become an activist photographer. But sometimes circumstances choose your path for you. Elena appeared through the pine trees, walking her own dog, a rescued Labrador mix whose previous owner had been unable to afford the surgery to remove his implanted device. She'd adopted Bruno and nursed him back to health, adding him to her growing collection of Project Watchtower survivors. "Morning, Smith family," she called out cheerfully. "Ready for the big day?" Today marked the official opening of the new Cedar Lake Community Center, built with funds from the federal settlement that compensated residents for the years of illegal surveillance. The center included a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, where Elena now practiced, along with meeting spaces for support groups and educational programs. "Tyler's been helping with the final preparations," Jake said. "He's become quite the community organizer." Tyler had indeed thrown himself into the recovery efforts with the idealism that Jake remembered from his own teenage years. The experience of seeing his father take a principled stand against powerful interests had strengthened their relationship in ways that years of careful conversations hadn't achieved. "Dr. Vasquez, can I ask you something?" Tyler said as they walked toward town together. "Do you think programs like Project Watchtower are still operating somewhere else?" Elena considered the question seriously. Tyler deserved an honest answer rather than false reassurance. "Probably," she said. "The technology exists, and there will always be people who want to use it improperly. But what happened here proves that these programs can't survive exposure. When communities work together and refuse to accept violations of their rights, even the most sophisticated surveillance can be defeated." They reached the town center, where early preparations for the community center's opening ceremony were already underway. Marcus Williams was helping to arrange chairs on the platform, having been released from federal custody after his cooperation led to successful prosecutions of high-level conspirators. Marcus's relationship with the community remained complicated. His 20-year collaboration with Project Watchtower couldn't be forgotten, but his final decision to support Jake and provide crucial evidence had earned him a measure of redemption. He now worked as a civilian consultant, helping other communities identify signs of surveillance programs. "Jake," Marcus called out as they approached. "The State Attorney General's office called. They want to discuss expanding your photography project to document recovery efforts in the other affected communities." Jake nodded. The work was important, but it also meant more time away from Cedar Lake, from Tyler, from the quiet life he'd originally sought. "Dad," Tyler said, seeming to read his thoughts, "you should do it. People need to see what you've documented here. And besides," he grinned, "I'll be heading to college soon anyway. You might as well do something meaningful with your empty nest time." Elena laughed. "Empty nest?" "Jake, Scout will keep you plenty busy." Scout, hearing his name, bounded over to join their conversation, tail wagging with the simple joy that reminded Jake why the fight had been worth it. Every family deserved to experience love without surveillance, privacy without violation, relationships without manipulation. As the morning progressed and more residents arrived for the ceremony, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 18 months ago, he'd been a broken man trying to rebuild his life in quiet isolation. A simple concern about bumps on his dog's back had led him into confrontation with a federal conspiracy, but it had also reconnected him with his community, his son, and his own sense of purpose. Dr. Holloway approached the platform, preparing to speak at the ceremony. She carried a clean bill of health from Elena's veterinary clinic scout's final medical report, showing no trace of the surveillance device and complete recovery of normal behavior patterns. "Mr. Smith," she said, handing him the document, "I think this belongs to you." Jake looked at the report scout's clean bill of health, representing not just his dog's recovery, but the community's healing and his family's restoration of trust. It was the perfect symbol of what they'd achieved together. Tyler stood beside him, no longer the sullen teenager who rarely visited, but a young man proud of his father's courage. Elena joined them, her hand finding Jake's in a gesture that spoke of partnership built through shared adversity. Scout sat at Jake's feet, alert and healthy, the embodiment of loyalty that had never wavered even when corrupted by others' intentions. As Dr. Holloway began her speech about transparency, community resilience, and the importance of protecting democratic values, Jake realized that Project Watchtower's greatest failure hadn't been in its exposure. It had been in underestimating the power of ordinary people who refused to accept that surveillance and manipulation were the price of security. Cedar Lake would never return to its previous innocence, but it had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that freedom requires constant vigilance, and the confidence that vigilance can succeed when communities stand together. The morning sun continued its rise over the lake, casting light on a town that had faced its darkest secrets and chosen to build something better from the truth.